Hey guys, what's going on? It's ya boy, Bowser Jr. Fan 13, and today we are back at it with another top 10. So today's top 10 will be about one of my favorite franchises, of course. Like, I've already done a top 10 of my favorite Mario games and favorite Mega Man games, so let's take a shot at it with my favorite Final Fantasy games. Alright. As you all may know, I'm a big Final Fantasy fan, because Mega 2K Combat Tales, that's like a big inspiration off of that franchise. So, anyways, I'm going to be telling you my top 10 favorite Final Fantasy games. Keep in mind, this list will only conclude Final Fantasies 1 through 10, mainly because I've never played 11 through 15. And I'm not really that interested in 11 through 15 because it's kind of a mixed bag. I mean, don't get me wrong, the games are good, but I just like the original classics overall. So, without further ado, let's get into this action, shall we? Number 10, we have Final Fantasy II, the second installment in the franchise. This game was not released in America. It was a Japan exclusive. We didn't get this game until they re-released it on different consoles. Final Fantasy II overall, it's kind of my least favorite out of the first 10. I mean, the game has good graphics, the soundtrack is really good, the story is pretty decent, it has some pretty cool characters, and it's overall pretty fine. My only problem with this game is the leveling up system, because it's kind of very atrocious. Like, you have to hit yourself or take damage in order to max out your HP or do all this random stuff just so your stats can increase. Like, why couldn't they just use the old level up status that they did back in Final Fantasy I? Not to mention the encounter rate is very annoying and the items are way expensive. So that's why I never usually beat Final Fantasy II, but if anyone can make a ROM hack where it's like a more easier, better version of Final Fantasy II, then maybe I'll reconsider playing the game. So Final Fantasy II is at number 10. Number 9, we have Final Fantasy VIII for the PlayStation 1. Final Fantasy VIII was the second game that came out on the PlayStation 1 next to 7. The game, well, I gotta say, the graphics look really good, because especially when you look at that beautiful FMV cutscenes, they're just so amazing. The love story is pretty neat, soundtrack is amazing, the designs is just, wow. I gotta hand it to Square Enix, because it's just overall really good. It has some pretty nice moments. Though, my only problem with this one, and why it's higher than 2, but it's lower than the others, is because, well, gameplay speaking, it's okay, but it's only the whole drawing magic that really holds this game back. I mean, I have to draw magic or exchange items just to use magic spells. Like, that kind of doesn't make sense. Like, I know they wanted to go with something new, but can't we just learn magic spells by default? Like, why do we have to buy magic or just straight up keep on drawing magic from random enemies just to do stuff? That doesn't make any sense. So Final Fantasy VIII is at number 9. Number 8, we have Final Fantasy III. Final Fantasy III, just like Final Fantasy II, it wasn't released in America, and it was Japan exclusive. We didn't get this game until 2006, which is kind of shocking considering that 2 and 5 came to America earlier than that. So, anyways, this game overall is pretty good. Graphics are okay, or pretty good. The soundtrack is beautiful, the gameplay is pretty good. Like, it brought in this whole job class system where you could be whatever jobs you want and change them whenever you need. It even introduced some new jobs, introduced summons, Moogles, and I forgot to mention Final Fantasy II introduced Chocobos and Sid, but this game introduced the Moogles, and it's really good. Though, my only problem with this one is, one, they brought back the spell charges from Final Fantasy I, which I was not a fan of, and 2, mainly because this game is like a lot harder than the other Final Fantasy games. So I've never played this game on the DS or on the NES emulator, but maybe I'll consider playing it sometime. So Final Fantasy III is overall, it's okay. So that's why it's at number 8. Number 7, we have Final Fantasy V. Like 2 and 3, this was another game that didn't come to America until a later time. Anyways, Final Fantasy V would be released on the PlayStation 1 called Final Fantasy Origins. Wait, no, not Origins. Final Fantasy Mythologies or something. I forgot what the name was, what it was called on the PlayStation 1, but I do know that the game was on Game Boy Advance and future consoles, so yeah. Game overall is pretty good. The story, I mean, it's not really much, it's just doing the same thing as Final Fantasy 1 and 3, but the characters are really good. It's pretty funny, because for a Final Fantasy game, this game barely takes its story so seriously, but there are some times when things can get serious. The visuals and gameplay is really good. The soundtrack is beautiful. I love how they brought back the job system from Final Fantasy III, only this time they made it better, which is pretty good. But another problem that I have with this game is, like 3 and the others, it's hard and really difficult. And I don't know why, but whenever I play Final Fantasy V, I just stop for no reason. Like, I don't know why. I mean, this game is really good, but I just can't really solve that mystery. But anyways, this game is at number 7. Number 6, we have Final Fantasy X. This game was one of the major Final Fantasy games that came on the PlayStation 2, and fans love this game to death. I mean, there are some that hate it, but there are most of people who love it. I pretty much like this game overall. I mean, this game was not only just the first 3D game that came on the PlayStation 2, or something like that, but this was the first game with voice acting, which I gotta say, the voice acting is hands down memorable and so good. Graphically speaking, it's just so awesome watching those cool, beautiful cutscenes. The story is pretty neat. Soundtrack, I mean, come on. Nobuo Uematsu is a masterpiece when it comes to Final Fantasy tracks. So the game overall is pretty good. By the way, not only that, this was the first Final Fantasy game to ever have a sequel. Final Fantasy X-2. Yeah, they didn't go to Final Fantasy XI until, like, releasing this game, and I'm like, oh my gosh, X-2? Are they serious with this? Well, X-2 overall is also a good game. I mean, I haven't played it yet, but I know for sure that it's really good because not only does it make a good sequel, the game was excellent when it brought back the job system, only this time they perfected it. It was just pretty good. So anyways, Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy X-2 is overall good games, and they both make a list on number 6. Okay, we reached the top 5 on my list. My most favorite Final Fantasy games of all time. Are you guys excited? Because I know I am. Number 5 comes Final Fantasy IX. This was the last game to come on the PlayStation 1 in the early 2000s. And I gotta say, what can I say that hasn't already been said about this game? The graphics overall is just so beautiful. They really outdid themselves for the last game on the PlayStation 1. And the cutscenes are just so, oh my gosh. Like, 7's cutscenes are awesome. 8's cutscenes are remarkable. But 9's cutscenes are a literal definition of beauty. The gameplay is so good, like, introduces the new trance modes where all the characters have these cool transformations and do cool attacks. It has memorable characters, the story was really good, the soundtrack, I mean, I don't even need to talk about the soundtrack because of how good it already is. And another thing I love about this game is that it goes back to the old roots of Final Fantasy. You know how the first 6 games takes place in the steampunk medieval timelines, while 7 and 8 takes place in a more futuristic city-like timelines, kind of like ours? But 9 goes straight back to those good old days that all Final Fantasy fans known and grown to love. It's a love letter to all fans, especially bringing in references from all the different games. Oh my gosh, Final Fantasy IX overall is a really awesome game, and that's why it's at number 5. I've never played this game, by the way, but I'm just dying to play this game. Number 4. Okay, those of you in the comments sections, please don't get mad at me because I put this game on this spot of the list, but it's just my opinion. Number 4 is Final Fantasy VI. This is one of the most popular Final Fantasy games of all time. It is beloved by the entire majority of the Final Fantasy fan base. Graphically speaking, for a Super Nintendo game, it's really good. Oh, by the way, since Final Fantasies 2, 3, and 5 did not come to North America at that time, Final Fantasy 3 was the name of this game. They renamed 6 Final Fantasy 3. I don't know why, but it is how it is. Just thought I'd let you guys know. The story is so emotional, like, there's so much stuff going on about this, like, so much tragic and things that go on, like, you just want to drop down into tears because of how beautiful the story is. Not to mention it has the best villain. It puts you in a scenario where, what would happen if the villain actually wins and succeeds? And it does exactly does that, and it executes it just properly. Gameplay is really good, has iconic characters, soundtrack, it's beautiful, and yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about this game. So Final Fantasy VI is at number 4. I don't know what it is that everyone just love about Final Fantasy VI. I can understand why people love this game, but to me, I just don't know why I don't feel the same affection as everyone else in the fan base, but I still love the game overall. Alright, now we arrive at the top 3 games. Number 3, Final Fantasy I, the original and classic. Final Fantasy I, for those of you who don't know, was probably gonna be the savior to Square Enix. Well, back when they were called Squaresoft, the developer Hironobu Sakaguchi, I'm sorry if I pronounced it wrong, he was, well, I don't know, he couldn't come up with a good game for the company, and if this game was not successful, then he would retire. But since it was successful, this franchise would become as great as we know to this day. I don't play the original NES version, mainly because it's so laggy, buggy, and it's really hard to beat. Whenever I play the NES version, I just stop. I don't really get that far because I can't just beat the game. But when I played the remastered versions, specifically the Game Boy Advance versions or any other version you can think of, these are overall better versions of Final Fantasy I. Graphically speaking, they're pretty good. Music is beautiful. The remastered version even includes new tracks. Let's see, gameplay is pretty good and basic. They fixed the gameplay that was in the NES version and made it a whole lot better. The story, well, there's not much story to go on about, but it's basic, so yeah. You can choose whatever classes you want to be the main characters. I love that aspect. I wish they could have continued with that in future Final Fantasy games, or bring that concept back. Well, they kind of did with Final Fantasy XI and 14, but overall, Final Fantasy I is the best. It's great. I love it to death. I don't recommend the NES version. The remastered or remake versions of this game, absolutely. So this game is at number 3. Not to mention that they also added extra dungeons that featured the bosses off of Final Fantasy 3, 4, 5, and 6, in case if you felt like the whole story gameplay wasn't enough for you. Number 2, we come to the most classical and most beautiful game of them all. Final Fantasy IV, or Final Fantasy II, if you played this game in North America. Well, it was called Final Fantasy II, because, you know. Final Fantasy IV overall is a really good game. It always feels so special to me. If there's any version I recommend of this game, it's both the 2D versions, and I love the 3D remake of it. I love the 3D remake on the DS mostly, specifically because, graphically speaking, the 3D graphics looks really good. It was a nice evolution to the Super Nintendo. The cutscenes in this game are so good. Like, it has all those cool cinematic cutscenes, and the voice acting is so good. Whoever got hired to do all those voices in the game, they need to get a high-stake promotion, or better yet, a big paycheck for that, because I just love it overall. Story overall is so amazing. It's filled with so much emotion, like so much redemption, betrayal, and sacrifices. I don't know what they were thinking with it, but it was pretty good. The characters are so memorable. Musically speaking, both the original and remake versions, both soundtracks, they sound amazing overall. The game can sometimes be a little bit funny with the whole "You spoony bard" line. But it's mostly emotional and mostly serious. Anyways, overall, Final Fantasy IV is a really good game. It's really beautiful. It also had a sequel called Final Fantasy IV: The After Years. I haven't played The After Years. Maybe I'll consider playing it if I beat Final Fantasy IV. I played the DS version, of course, because I had it. And mainly, this has got to be like the most hardest version of them all, especially the Japanese version, because when thinking of the difficulty for Final Fantasy, the original versions are pretty easy, but the Japanese and the DS versions are just hard overall. So yeah, there you go if you wanted a challenge. So anyways, this game makes it at number 2. Before I get to my final pick on the list, as per usual, here's one Bowser Jr. Fan 13 honorable mentions. Dissidia Final Fantasy. It's hands down one of the greatest crossover Final Fantasy games, because when you think of the Dissidia series, I think of all the Final Fantasy games ever created, 1 through 10, 11 through 15, Tactics, Type 0, Crystal Chronicles, etc. Basically, all the games are just basically all the main heroes and the main villains from each Final Fantasy game uniting, and you know, the usual good versus evil scenario, this conflict that's going on. Like, there's so much that's happening. It's just so awesome. It makes an epic Infinity War or Avengers Endgame crossover. I love it specifically mainly because it's a crossover with the first 10 Final Fantasy characters, and when I think of those characters, of course I'm gonna play this game. Dissidia Final Fantasy is really good. NT, it's pretty fun, and Opera Omnia, a good mobile game. Okay, don't be surprised that I put this game on number 1, because you guys already know what it's going to be. Number 1 on the list is Final Fantasy VII. Can you blame me? Because honestly, this is literally the Final Fantasy game that drove me to be a fan. Graphically speaking, it's really amazing for a PlayStation 1 game. Cutscenes are beautiful. I love the story. There's so much going on in the story. So much funny stuff, some serious stuff, some emotional stuff. Overall, the story is just so beautiful and great. The gameplay, I love the gameplay so much with its materia system, the limit breaks. The mini games are just so fun to play. I love playing through all the mini games. The music is so awesome. I just love listening to all the tracks, like One Wing Angel, Genova. There's so many songs going on that you just can't help yourself but to jam to. This game is so popular. This even started like a whole Final Fantasy VII compilation, whereas it gets put into different games like, you know, Dissidia, Theater Rhythm, Record Keeper, Brave Escavus. It would also be in some games like Kingdom Hearts. It even has some of its own sequels or prequels like Before Crisis, Crisis Core, Dirge of Cerberus, Advent Children. Alright. Final Fantasy VII is just so good. I love the iconic characters. Best protagonist in the game, Cloud Strife. Best villain in the game, Sephiroth. And all the other characters are just so memorable and so awesome. So, anyways, overall, Final Fantasy VII is just so cool. I love playing through Final Fantasy VII Remake. I played the demo on Damon's channel. You can go check it out if you want. I love to see Part 2 for Final Fantasy VII Remake, because I can't wait to see all the cool alternatives they could come up with. So, Final Fantasy VII is number 1 on the list. And that's all we have for today, folks. Let me know in the comments down below what is your favorite Final Fantasy game, and I'll see you guys next time. So, peace out, everyone.